We are in Acts chapter 18, running through this book. Sometime in another couple of months we'll be through with it, I think. And so we need to start kicking around what might we want to study after this one is over and get ahead of the game instead of waiting until the last week or two. So y'all be thinking about that, and we'll see what we're going to do after we finish Acts. Let's pray. God, thank you for caring for us. Thank you for bringing each of us here this evening. I just pray that your Spirit is here to guide our discussion and our study, and we're learning those things you want us to know so that we can be better children for you. Thank you for caring for us. Thank you for providing for us. God, even though we've been talking over here on this side of the room about food and prices, God, you just bless us. This nation is just bountiful with all the things we get to enjoy and experience. Thank you for letting us be here. We praise you for all the good that you do for us in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So where did we end chapter 17?
Athens.
In Athens. Remember, he goes and he debates the philosophers, and then he doesn't seem to have a whole lot of success. He gets a few, Luke names a couple of people, and then he leaves and he's on his way to Corinth. Where is Corinth?
Right down the street.
Right down the street. You know, for the longest time, I had no clue where Corinth was until I finally got smart and looked at a map. It's just right below Athens. I mean, it's right there. It's a Greek city. It doesn't make a whole lot of news like Athens and Sparta and some of those other Greek cities do. It had games like the Olympics. They weren't as famous as the Olympics, but every 2 years they had Isthmus Games and did all the same stuff the Olympic stuff did, but for some reason they didn't laugh like the Olympics did. But it is a big city. It is a popular city. Paul travels there. We learn a lot about Corinth and just a little history of the city. It's a crucial communication center. Corinth is the capital city of Achaia, which is the southern part of what we would call Greece today. It's a Roman Empire city. It had been destroyed and then rebuilt somewhere around 40-something BC. So we're roughly 90 to 100 years old now by the time Paul's there. It's a land route. People coming in north and south as well as east and west. It's a huge harbor. They had 2 harbors, in fact. Very popular city, very wild city. People would call it the Sin City of Achaia. Some of the articles I read said that you would be Corinthianized, meaning you were just a hedonistic, crazy person that would do just about anything you wanted to do. And so it was slang for sexually immoral people. Not a very good place. You would think this would be a city that wouldn't be very adaptable to Christianity, but as you well know, it takes root quite well. The city does well. It grows well. Christianity is taken up and allows Paul to stay there for quite a while. The church grows. He writes a couple of letters to them. Remains a strong Christian community for quite some time. Paul, writing back to the church in Corinth, I think addresses the sexual issue when he says, neither the sexually immoral, nor the idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who have sex with men, or thieves, and it goes on and on, shall inherit the kingdom of God. And he lists a bunch of sexual sins. And somewhere along the way he says, you guys were that, but you're not anymore, and so we're glad you found Jesus, and off you go. But they must have had a real tough time, I would think, giving up a lot of that stuff to become Christians. It's a lifestyle that they would have known well. A lot of idol worshiping, not quite as well known as Athens. There's not as many idols and things standing around there, but it is still a very strong idol, false god worshiping community. That's where they head next. That's where they land. Who do we meet there?
Priscilla and Aquila.
Priscilla and Aquila. What do we know about Priscilla and Aquila?
They're tent makers.
They are tent makers, and we'll talk about them. Where did they come from?
Rome.
Came from Rome. You guys are right on top of stuff. As you said, they're tent makers. Why did they come from Rome?
They're Jews.
The emperor
They
put
were
them
not
out.
Jews.
Yeah, Luke tells us that, and we touch on this in some other areas. We touched on it before. They apparently go back. When Paul writes the letter to Romans, they're back there, so they go back after some period of time. But they're people that we get used to reading about and hearing about through the rest of the Bible. Paul mentions them in some of his writings. What's one of the weird things about Priscilla and Aquila? We haven't mentioned yet.
Well, Priscilla's mentioned 5 times first.
Yeah, her name is first, which in a male-dominated Roman world, that's very unusual. And so the theologians suggest, and they have no way of knowing, but they're just throwing out ideas, either she was the more strong Christian, or she came from, some people suggest she came from a higher caste of people, and so she got named first because she was more important than her husband. Again, some suggest she worked in the church better, more, and Paul appreciated what she did more than maybe what her husband had done, and so he frequently names her first, which again is something that we don't see happen very often. They're thrown out of Rome, as we mentioned. We've touched on this before a little bit, that the emperor, for whatever reason, decided to kick all the Jews out of the city and exiles them. And later, when the new emperor comes in, he releases that ban and they all go back. Nobody knows for sure why they did that. A lot of ideas are the Jews were causing some riots, they were causing some trouble. What was unique about the Jews in the Roman Empire when it comes to worship?
They were left alone and do their thing.
That's exactly right. They had an exemption. They didn't have to worship idols. They didn't have to worship Caesar. For the longest time, the Roman Empire gave them a pass, and so they could acknowledge the God they worship. They were monotheistic, so they didn't worship all the idols. They didn't worship the Olympic and Roman gods, and they got a pass. Some suggest that the emperor who kicked them out got tired of that and decided, if you're not going to be here and worship me as a god, you can just get out of my city. But they really don't know why for sure they got kicked out, but they did, and again, they got to come back sometime later. They're tent makers like Paul. Paul's a tent maker, and so when he gets to Corinth and gets to know these people, he starts making tents with them. Why does he do that?
Pulling his weight.
Pulling his weight. He needed some money. Later, when the others join him and they bring in some money to him, maybe he stops being a tent maker. But right now, he's basically been chased from city to city. He doesn't have any income. He's doing whatever, and so he's got to trade. One of the articles I read for this said that was an ancient Jewish tradition, that the rabbis who would go around preaching and teaching had to have a trade. You couldn't just be a bum and go around teaching and preaching. You had to have some way to, as you said, carry your own weight. And so that was Paul's career. He made tents. Aquila and Priscilla made tents. So he stays with them for a while. Nobody knows for sure when they become Christians. They're there already, apparently. And he ties in with them and works with them. He mentions them several times in some of his writings. He calls them fellow workers. In another spot, he will say they risked their life for him, whatever that means. He doesn't give any details on what they did to risk their lives for him. But apparently they do something for him and befriends him in such a way that he holds these people very dear, apparently. He speaks fondly with them all the time, or about them all the time. And again, we'll run across them a time or two later as we move forward. Where does Paul go when he shows up in Corinth? Where does he start teaching?
At the synagogue.
At the synagogue again. You know, even though he's kicked the dust off and all this other stuff in other places, he still goes to the synagogue. And we talked about this a little last few times, that he's still trying to persuade the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. he wants his fellow countrymen to be saved. And so he's telling them about Jesus. He's doing his best to help them know who the Christ is. And while he's there teaching there in Corinth, Silas and Timothy rejoin him. He had left them in Thessalonica. And he shows up in Corinth, starts teaching and preaching. And there comes Timothy and Silas. They come from Macedonia. They bring good news. When we read the book of Thessalonians, Paul writes about how they brought the good news. They're doing well. Thessalonica is another church Paul seemed to be really fond of, sort of like the church at Philippi. Both of those communities apparently did well for him. And so Timothy shows up with some money from Philippi. We hear about that in 2 Corinthians 11. So they've helped him financially. That's got to have boosted Paul's morale, I would think. He's been chased from city to city. He doesn't get any real success in Athens. So my guess is he's on sort of a bummer. He's not doing well. And so he must have been really cheered up to have Silas and Timothy show up with a bunch of cash so he didn't have to work. Scott.
During his time in Corinth, he writes 1st and 2nd Thessalonians.
Yeah, they believe that's correct.
So, how do those two different letters, how do they get there? I mean, obviously you said these two guys just showed up. Was there other people with them? And he's like, hey, here, I wrote this letter, take this back. Yeah, I mean, I'm unclear on how these letters got from wherever Paul was to wherever he wanted them to go. There was no mailman.
There is no mailman. You weren't here yet.
Yeah, maybe a camel express, I don't know.
Tradition tells us many times, and Paul will say in some of his writings, so-and-so is carrying this. And it may have been Epaphroditus, who's one of these people who comes and goes. He seems to show up a lot. Paul's got some traveling companions. He doesn't talk about any really being with him here when he shows up. But people are always traveling. And
So
really
it's
the
sort
mail...
of a network of people coming and going.
Yes. And
we're hearing about Paul and what he's doing.
People going everywhere. Church
Yeah.
people moving, but not just church people. There's trade routes.
Because obviously he would need to hear about what was going on in these places in order for him to pen a letter in the first place.
Absolutely.
Somebody had to come tell, you wouldn't believe what's happening, Thessalonica. They're doing this and this.
Well, when we get to 1 Corinthians, and he writes that, and we study that on Sunday mornings, it actually says people from Chloe's household, like, received some word from them about what's going on. So you're absolutely correct. People would show up. Oh, let's train go by. People would show up and tell them about the church. I mean, we're so used to the church that when we travel, even if you go to church somewhere while you're traveling, unless it's a place you go frequently, you're really not tied in with those people in the church. You go show up on Sunday morning, you worship, some 2 or 3 people may talk to you, and then you're on your way. Never another thought about those people. That isn't what's happening here. These people, because they're so unique, starting a new religion in essence, they become much more, I think, networked than we think about it today. They had a much better tie because many of them were being persecuted, especially those who were Jews, are being kicked out of the synagogues, or being beat up, as we see some here, and being chased all over the place. And so they've got a bond that I think is tough for us to grasp. And so they are glad to hear about each other. They're glad to stay in touch with each other. Again, Corinth is a huge metropolitan area with a lot of people, trade people coming and going. Paul could very well, for these letters that we don't know how they got from one place or another, might have paid somebody. Here's a couple of denarii. If you're headed to Timbuktu, would you take this and drop it off at so-and-so's house? And sometimes I suppose they gave that money and the letter never showed up. But other times it does.
Luckily these came through.
Yeah, that's it. Sometimes they do show up. And many times, as Paul will say in his letters, he names the people who's carrying the letter for him. So he's got contacts and people that he knows. that carry the letters for him. We don't know for sure on all of them because he doesn't mention it in all of them. But we look at these cities here, they're not all that far apart.
Right.
I mean, they're just right down the coast, back and forth. So there were probably people going back and forth there all the time. Maybe even potentially Roman soldiers who ran a beat back and forth. And so Paul could easily have said to them, here's some cash, would you drop this off, somewhere along the way. And my guess is people were much more honest back then when it came to those kinds of things and probably did what they were asked to do, especially if they got paid to do it. But many times we don't know. But your guess is as good as ours. Somebody that Paul knew or somebody he contracted with carry these letters back.
So we would assume during the year and a half or whatever that he's in Corinth,
Right?
these letters at some point were written and
Hauled up there by somebody. Yeah. I haven't read 1 Thessalonians lately, so I don't know if he actually says in the book, so-and-so's carrying it for me. It may. But that's generally what would happen. Somebody with Paul would carry the letters. Somebody he knew, and again, he mentions that in some of his letters, that that's what's happened. And in others, like say in 1 Corinthians, he mentions people from Chloe's household has told me about what's going on here. And so he's writing the letter in response to the information he got back to this church when he gets away from there. But generally what he says is right, somebody gets found and somebody hauls a letter back and forth. We don't know how many other letters there might have been that never got to where they were supposed to go.
beginning of the postal service.
That's exactly correct. People suggest, the scholars suggest, there's at least 4 letters written to the church at Corinth. 2 of them we haven't got. We don't have any clue what, because Paul mentions in one of his letters, remember the second letter I sent you, blah, blah, blah. Well, we don't have a second letter. 2 Corinthians is apparently the 3rd letter.
Be cool if they could find it.
It would be awesome to see what it said.
Crammed in a cave somewhere.
Maybe. Of course, my belief is if we needed it, we'd have it.
Sure.
God would have preserved it for us, so there isn't anything in it we need. Of course, I can read 3 John and think there's not a whole lot in that little book either, but it's there for us. It's got to have something that will be a benefit to us.
Sure.
But I am sure Paul wrote many other letters than the ones we have in the Bible. Were they inspired by the Holy Spirit? Probably not, otherwise we would have them. The fact that Paul writes letters doesn't mean everything he writes is an inspired word of God, any more than you and me, if we're writing letters to people, are inspired words of God, even though we're Christians.
Well, you got to figure if we had every single letter that he ever wrote,
We'd need a,
the Bible would be this tall.
at least, yeah. So I think my
we got
belief,
the stuff we need.
yeah, that's what I believe. God, if we believe God is the God he says he is, and I do, he's preserved the books we need. And if we don't have them, it's because we don't need them. And I trust him to take care of us that way, not to hold us accountable to something we haven't got. And so I agree with you that if we needed it, we'd have it. Thoughts? So he goes to the synagogue. He's there preaching and teaching like he's supposed to. He writes back, when he writes back to the church at Corinth, he says he first arrived with weakness and fear and much trembling, 1 Corinthians 2:3. He doesn't say why, but for some reason when he first gets to Corinth, he's not doing well. He's not feeling well. And again, some suggest he must be really bummed out from the no reception he got in Athens. The scholars just weren't willing to listen to him. And for some reason, he was disappointed. And so he shows up in Corinth. He's weak, he's fearful, he's trembling. But after Timothy and Silas show up, he writes here in Acts chapter 15, or 18, that he devoted himself exclusively to preaching and testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. So, again, he must get a real bump when these guys show up, bring him some money from Philippi. Now he doesn't have to work. He can spend all of his time teaching and preaching and doing what he really feels God has called him to do. So what happens to him there? What do the Jews do?
They opposed him again.
Once again, can you imagine Put yourself in Paul's place for just a minute, and you've got a career that moves you from place to place.
So you
And
can get free death.
Yeah, everywhere you go. While you may start on a high note, within a very short amount of time, there's a bunch of people out to get you. You know, in Thessalonica, they go and hire thugs from the marketplace. They're not even Jews who are upset. They hire bad guys to come after Paul. He's beaten, he's stoned, I believe stoned to death in one spot. Every place he goes, he starts out well, and the next thing you know, they're after him. And these aren't who would consider Paul's enemies. Paul's Jewish. He's rised up through the ranks. He's a well-known, influential Jewish person. And these are the ones who are attacking him. The ones who should have been listening to him. The one he goes to save. Every place he goes, they turn on him. Same thing happens here. He shows up there, he goes to the synagogue, they oppose him. In response to that, he says he shook his clothes off in protest against them and said, your blood be on your own heads, I'm innocent of it. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles. Well, how many times have we heard this before? At least 2 other times. And obviously he's not meaning, I'm never going to teach any more Jews, because he'll get back to Jews here before we know it. But as far as the church at Corinth, the people in Corinth are concerned, I'm done with you Jew people. I'm not coming to the synagogues on Saturday anymore. I'm going to the Gentiles because they'll listen to me. They want to hear the gospel. They're willing to take it. But here, once again, he apparently meets initial success, and then before you know it, the leaders of the synagogue are on his backside, and they're giving him a hard time, and he says, your blood be on your heads.
Doesn't he at some point say he would trade his own salvation for,
Yes.
where's it in Romans?
It's in Romans.
Yeah. He says, I would gladly count myself as lost if my brothers could be saved. He loved these Jewish people.
So that's obviously why he continues to go to these synagogues.
Oh, I think so.
And still.
Try it one more time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And,
This time they'll listen.
and of course some do.
Sure.
I mean, some of the Jews do listen. He does convert many of them, enough to where the others in the synagogue are getting worried. They're losing converts. They're losing donors. And so they're thinking, wait a minute, we've got to shut this guy up. And that's when, I suspect, that's when the uprising happens, is when he crosses this threshold of converts to where now it's putting a dent in the synagogue business. And so these people who were still there, dependent upon the synagogue, that's when they get all upset and come after him. That's my idea. Bible doesn't necessarily say that. We know that happens when he converts the Gentile, or changes the Gentile girl who's got that demon. When he throws the demon out, the people who are using her to make money, they get all upset. That's when they come after him. And my guess is that has something to do with the Jews as well. When they were starting to get infringed upon, that's when they get mad at Paul. If nobody listens to him, they don't care. He's just some other rabble-rouser talking his mouth off. But he starts getting converts. In fact, here in Corinth, he gets a synagogue leader to convert. And so he has some real success here in Corinth, enough to where these people come after him. So what does this phrase come from? Your blood be on your own heads. Everybody should know where that comes from. It comes from the book of Ezekiel. Turn over to, well, you don't have to turn over. Let me just read it to you. You don't have to turn over there. Ezekiel's a really cool passage. Let me see if I can find the right verse before I hunt for it all over the place. Verse 6. Ezekiel, this is the watchman on the wall passage. And it says, the word of the Lord came to me. This is Ezekiel speaking. Son of man, speak to your countrymen and say to them, when I bring the sword against a land and the people of the land choose one of their own men and make him a watchman, and he sees the sword coming against the land and blows the trumpet to warn the people, then if anyone hears the trumpet but does not take warning, and the sword comes and takes his life, his blood will be on his own head. Since he heard the sound of the trumpet, but did not take warning, his blood will be on his own head. If he had taken warning, he would have saved himself. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet to warn the people, and the sword comes and takes the life of one of them, the man will be taken away because of his sin, but I will hold the watchman accountable for his blood. So Paul quotes the prophet Ezekiel to say, I've warned you. I've told you about what's happening. I've told you what's going to go on if you don't listen. You're not listening, so your blood be on your own head. Paul's proclaiming to them, I'm the watchman on the wall. I'm telling you the enemy's here, and you need to listen. But since you're not listening, you're done. Your blood's on your own head. I'm not responsible for you going to hell anymore, is basically what he's saying. I'm doing my best to teach you the truth. If you're not going to listen, you're done. And so he does that. And again, it doesn't mean he no longer goes to the synagogues, because we see him doing that as he continues on. But he's going to leave the Corinthian Jews to themselves. They're going to have to take care of themselves here. So how long does Paul stay in Corinth?
Year and a half.
Stays a year and a half. That's pretty long. How long does he stay in Ephesus on his third journey?
3 years.
3 years. And that's the first longest place. This is apparently the second longest place. That's why people suggest he does very well here. He converts a lot of people in Corinth. And again, he writes 2 letters back to them. And the church, while it's got struggles, is still a healthy, well-growing bunch of people church. And it's again in this city that is a horrible, sinful city. It'd be almost like in America going to Vegas, or downtown New York City or somewhere where, sin is rampant, and you'd think nobody in the world is going to listen to the gospel here. But in Corinth, they do. And Paul is there. He isn't there very long, unfortunately, before the rumblings start again. And he's already told them, I'm shaking the clothes off. I'm done with you guys. But he's already having a problem. What happens to him here that boosts his spirit?
It's a vision.
He has a vision. What does the vision say?
It says, for not to be afraid, keep on speaking, don't be silent, I am with you.
There you go. Verse 12, just what Emily says. Jesus comes to him and says, don't be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. I'm with you. No one is going to attack you and harm you, because I have many people in this city. I don't know about you, but that would make me feel pretty cool. I would think, okay, let's get on with it. And here he's not only told I've got a lot of, God telling him I've got a lot of people in the community, but they're not going to harm me here. You're going to be okay. And I think that must have emboldened him to just really get out there and speak the truth to people. And that's why the church does so well, I think. Scott?
So we're assuming that this is only the second time that Jesus has spoke directly to him.
I would say maybe the third time.
What was the second?
The second time is when he goes back to Tarsus after he's converted. He will later say, the things revealed to me was not revealed by men, but by the Lord himself.
Oh, yeah.
So somewhere along the way, he's had some other training by God.
Because this is a long period of time from when he was blinded
It is.
to now.
Yes.
It's like 20 years or something.
Yep.
That's a long time to be doing what he's doing. But I guess if you're blinded and, Jesus talks directly to you, I guess it leaves a pretty impact on your life.
You would think it would.
Yeah.
And of course, he's told by Ananias, you're going to be the messenger to the Gentiles. And so he's going to all these Gentile communities, even though he stops at the synagogues first. Ultimately, he shakes the dust off and moves to the Greeks. But I think you're right. Paul's life is pretty cool. He's got this career choice. He's moving right up the ladder. He's going to be somebody really important in the Jewish world. Along comes Jesus and says, not really. You're going to be my messenger. You're going to go to the Gentiles. Not only are you not going to be famous with the Jews, I'm going to send you out here with all these dogs. You're going to convert all these people that, in your way of thinking, aren't even worth eating with. But you're going to do that, Paul, and he does. And like we've already mentioned, everywhere he goes, he encounters turmoil. He encounters pushback. He gets
Well,
thrown.
and when they stoned him
Yeah,
and killed him,
Yeah, I really think he died.
he just got up and went
Yeah.
back in town.
Yeah.
Didn't even, just right back to it. Didn't even bat
That's
an
right.
eye. It really, it's amazing to think of, and he's 20 years in and he's got quite a few years to go. still.
Yeah, he's not anywhere close to done yet.
Nope. And all the stuff that he's going through, it just sounds,
There's a passage,
hard,
yeah.
real hard.
And I don't know if it's Romans or wherever it is, where he goes through that litany of all these things that have happened to him, beaten so many times, shipwrecked so many times, thrown in prison so many times, all this stuff he goes through. Like the ever-ready bunny, he just keeps on going. And he's going all the way until he dies. What a faith. What a guy this man
Seems
must
like
have
the
been.
only thing that he really gets upset about is that he can't get the Jews to listen to what he's saying.
Yeah.
Other than that, the rest of this stuff doesn't seem to bother him too bad. Getting chained up in a prison,
Well, it
rocks
doesn't.
thrown at him, beat up, thrown around. The only thing that really seems to upset him is the fact that the Jews, so many of them won't listen to him.
Yeah, he wants those people saved.
Sure.
Because he knows Jesus is the Messiah the Jews have been looking for hundreds and hundreds of years. And they just won't listen. That had to be a real bummer. To know that I know the truth, and I'm teaching you, and these Gentiles believe it more than you do. What's wrong with this picture? We're the children of God, and you're turning away the Messiah. And these dogs, these Gentiles, they're coming to the church in droves. It had to be a downer.
Sure.
And so for Jesus to speak to him here, because again, Paul writes back to Corinth and says, I showed up, I'm bummed out, I'm weak, I'm scared, I'm trembling. I get a feeling Jesus knew his tank was empty. And he needed a respite. He needed an opportunity to just stay in a place, relax, see a lot of success, even if it wasn't with the Jews. But again, he converts the synagogue ruler in this community, so he does get some success. But I think Jesus could see, and this is just me talking, that he knew Paul needed a place to relax for a while, a place where things went well, where he's surrounded by friends. He's got Aquila and Priscilla and Timothy and Silas and a whole bunch of other people as the church grows and grows. And so he just gives him a bonus and lets him
I'm
sit
sure
there.
the vision had to kind of recharge.
Well, exactly.
Kind of like, wow, okay, he's still with me.
Had to. And I think God just does that sometimes. And I suspect he's done it to all of us from time to time. When life wasn't going well and we're getting bummed out about something, something happens in your life where you look at it and think, God, I needed that. Because he cares about us. He doesn't want us to get bummed out and give up. So he sends us every once in a while I say every once in a while, he does it all the time. But sometimes we notice it more, that ray of sunshine that just, we think, thanks a lot. I needed to hear that today. I needed somebody to come say something to me today. And I think that's what's happened to Paul here. Paul, you had a comment?
I had a lot of problems with those things.
You did.
You couldn't think about the fact, when Jesus went in and met that woman at the well, the people in her country, again, they were rejected
Yep.
by the Israelis.
Yeah, the Samaritans, they weren't cared for. They're half-breeds. The Jews don't like them. But God has a way of reaching people that want to hear about him. And so he's got Paul here for at least a year and a half. And he does well. Church grows. It's a strong church for a long time. I'd like to say he even converts the synagogue ruler, which must have been pretty cool. Paul must have thought, ooh, I've got a cool chance here. So what happens to Paul here in Corinth?
But the Jews rise up against him.
Here we are. You know, he's got this vision. Things are going well. He's thinking this is going to be cool. Up come the Jews to say, wait a minute, we're not going to put up with this. And notice here, Luke says they do a united attack. This isn't just a little bit of 2 or 3 coming here, 2 or 3 coming there. Why do you think Luke notices that here, that it's a united attack by the Jews? What's happened to make it be united?
Maybe because he's getting, from different synagogues, he's getting a whole lot of people coming his way.
I think that, and the synagogue ruler.
Yeah.
I mean, he's converted the synagogue ruler. And that had to put some fear into the other Jews to think, wait a minute, he just took our preacher away. You know, the guy who's leading the synagogue is now following Paul. So the Jews in the city must somewhere along the way have decided, we better all get together and put a stop to this, or we're not going to have any people left. And so they do, and they go after him. They haul him up to the place of judgment. Remember, in Athens, he goes to the Areopagus, which is the hearing place. He doesn't seem to be under arrest or anything there, but he gets a chance to show up and defend himself. Same thing's here. He's not really arrested. It's just the Jews have grabbed him, and they haul him to the place of judgment. They bring him before this magistrate to make some accusations against him. The neat thing we have here is Luke mentions who the guy is. And so we can date Paul's time in Corinth with great certainty. According to historical documents, proconsuls took office July 1st and held the office for a year. And so this guy, Gallio, he is there from July of 51 to June of 52. And so Paul clearly is in Corinth between July of 51 and June of 52, because that's the only time this guy is proconsul there. And he's a very famous guy, apparently very well known. One of his brothers is Seneca, who is a great philosopher in the Greek world. Another one is some guy who becomes the father of some poet named Lucas. So this guy's family is well known. He's a popular guy, which is probably why he gets the job for a year. Somebody's influenced Caesar to name him, and so he gets this job. And we know from secular records, he holds it for this 1 year. So Paul, when he's brought before him, is there somewhere between July of 51 and June of 52. Some suggest that the Jews want to bring Paul before him because he's just been appointed, he's new, he'll want to impress the higher ups, so maybe I can get another job somewhere else. And so they're thinking, let's haul Paul over there and say he's teaching against the law. He's not supporting Caesar. And notice that's the argument they make. This man is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. And they're hoping, I suspect, that if this Gallio guy will buy into that, he'll punish Paul. He'll do, maybe kill him. Who knows what will happen. So what does Paul do? How does he defend himself?
Well, he doesn't really get a chance.
He doesn't get to. This is so cool here.
Yeah.
This guy comes right along and says, hey, why did you in essence bring this guy to me? This involves questions about your own words, your own names, your own law. Settle this among yourself. I'm not wasting my time on
Pretty
this
much
nonsense.
he says, don't bother.
That's exactly what he says.
You're bothered.
I'm not Jewish. I don't care what you people are worrying about. Because apparently he's heard some things, or the hubbub that gets Paul there has given enough of a description of, this guy's telling us that the Messiah is Jesus and we know he's not, and he's causing trouble in our synagogues. And this guy says, what do I care? Do what you want to do, but I'm not doing anything. It's almost like the guy, back there in Thessalonica, who, when they haul the people, whatever, Jason in front of him, says, give me a break. It makes him post a bond, let's move on. So some of these people aren't buying the Jews' arguments that Paul's creating havoc. The scholars look at this and think, what law is he violating? Their argument is he's teaching people to worship contrary to the law. What's the law they're talking about?
The Roman law or the Greek law?
That would be the argument, that it must be violating, we're not worshiping Caesar, but neither are the Jews. I mean, they can't really bring Paul up before the proconsul and say, he's teaching us not to worship Caesar. Well, the Jews don't worship Caesar anyway. So several of the commentaries I read argued about it forever, and I'm thinking, just read verse 15. It says what the law is. This guy says, it involves questions about words and names, and your own law, settle it for yourself. So the Jews apparently are coming before the proconsul saying, he's violating Jewish law. And as Scott says, he says, what do I care? Butt out. I don't care about your Jewish law. Leave me alone. And so for some reason, they go beat up on the guy who's at that time the new synagogue ruler, apparently. They beat him up.
Yeah.
And this guy didn't even care. What do I care? Paul.
Well, also, Jesus said, I will not judge you. While now, and you do, I tell people, don't judge other people.
Mm-hmm.
I will judge you in heaven, basically, where you're going to be in heaven or not. But, when you're on earth, don't treat other people badly. Don't treat them,
Yeah, but they're not listening to that. They're treating Paul pretty badly. But this judge says, this doesn't have anything to do with Roman law. I'm not the proconsul of your church.
I get the impression, reading through this, that the Romans don't necessarily take the Jews very seriously. Sort of like, what do they want now?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
You guys are always bothering us for some silly Jewish thing. You get the impression that the Romans just look at them like, oh, for crying out loud, what do they want now,
Yep. And it may be that these Jews are hoping because, again, Priscilla and Aquila's just been kicked out of Rome because of whatever happened there, that they're coming to the proconsul thinking, well, we can get these people kicked out. But they're not even thinking, if we kick Paul out because he's teaching this Jewish stuff, they might kick us out. I mean, they're not even thinking. And so this guy says, leave me alone. This passage right here, I've said this several times teaching Acts, very important chapter, really key passage in the book. While the teaching here isn't that important, that act apparently is very important. The fact that this Gallio guy doesn't prosecute Paul has been taken by the historians as a watershed event in the Christian movement. Because he apparently is somebody important. He's got some influence. He's got a brother that's very important. And we watch here for this year and a half or so, the church seems to be not bothered. It doesn't seem to be attacked, even in other communities. It seems to grow well for some period of time. And so a lot of the historians look back at this guy's decision to not prosecute Paul, and basically it becomes a watershed lawsuit case, like you'd have some judge rule on some issue and everybody else says, okay, that's fine, that this guy's got enough clout that when he doesn't prosecute Paul for what he's doing, all the other proconsuls and judges and Roman court people in the areas decide, we're not going to prosecute him either. We're not going to prosecute these Christians. This is a Jewish issue. We're not going to worry about it. And the church apparently enjoys some time of peace for the next couple of years.
Well, I can't help but notice that right before all of this, Jesus tells Paul,
Yes.
hey, do whatever you want to do. I'm with you. I got
That's
your
it.
back. Don't be
Yep.
afraid.
Yep.
Go say what you want, do what you want.
Yep.
And it obviously comes true because he gets in front of this guy and the guy's, get out of here. I don't have time for this.
Yep. And he doesn't even care that the Jews beat up the news leader of the synagogue. Oh, you
Yeah.
guys just go mind your own business, leave us alone.
But Paul doesn't suffer at all.
That's right. Nothing happens to him.
Absolutely.
He stays in this town, and we'll see him in just a minute. He leaves, he travels all over the place. He doesn't run into any problems for quite a while. He gets some kind of relief here because of this ruling that says, we're not going to mess her up. We don't care about what you Jews are doing. Leave us alone. We're not going to prosecute this guy. We're not going to punish him. In some other places he gets whipped. He gets thrown out of the city. They don't do anything, it's just
Wide open.
go away, leave us alone. So he stays here for quite a while, a year and a half at least, preaching the gospel, converting people. And again, like I say, the historians say that decision probably turned out to be something very important for the church for the next few years. Because we don't see any persecution of the church for quite a while in this part of the Roman Empire. Because this guy had enough clout to say, we're not messing with this, we're not playing these games with you. And so off they go. He goes on to say, he stays in Corinth for a while. Luke, in about a few verses says, they leave, he's on his way home, he goes to Crenchia where he cuts his hair off. We could talk forever about what happens there. Some kind of a vow Paul makes.
Yeah, we were talking about that before class started. Is there any indication, anybody anywhere that has any idea what the vow was?
It's all a guess. Nobody knows.
So there's
Some
nothing-
suggest there's a Nazarene vow, which you do, but you cut your hair off. When you end your vow, you shave your head. Most of the commentaries say, well, Paul doesn't shave his head here. He cuts his hair. And there is Jewish tradition that if you're not in Jerusalem, so you can't get your hair to the temple, that you can cut your hair off shorter and then you carry that with you until you get to Jerusalem, rather than just let your hair grow like crazy, because you're not supposed to cut your hair if you've taken a Nazirite vow until the vow's over, and then you shave your head. And so some suggest that maybe this was a Nazirite vow, and Paul, because he's nowhere close to Jerusalem, is allowed to cut his hair off some, but he doesn't shave his head yet. Others suggest it may have been a personal vow that Paul made, and to support that I mean what I mean, he cuts his hair some. They really don't know. There's no indication anywhere of what this vow was. Most of the commentaries, though, would suggest what Paul's showing here and what Luke is showing here. Remember, Luke's a Gentile. He's not Jewish. But he emphasizes over and over and over all the Jewish kind of things Paul does. And so Luke is emphasizing by telling us about that. Paul still thinks he's a Jew. Paul's still doing Jewish stuff. He doesn't have to stop being Jewish simply because he's a Christian. And I like that idea, because Luke makes it pretty clear that Paul continues to do Jewish things even though he's now a Christian. He takes vows and cuts his hair. He wants to get to Jerusalem for the feast days. He's doing all kinds of things. He's in the synagogue.
Goes to the synagogue.
Yeah,
Gets there.
every time he goes, he's in there every Saturday teaching in the synagogue. So I think Luke's trying to tell us, Paul is still Jewish. You people who are thinking he's trying to totally revamp Jewish things, he's not. You can still be Jewish and follow Jesus. You don't have to give up Jewish life. And I think there's probably some sense to that. But notice here, Luke covers a lot of miles in about 4 verses. They leave there, they go to Ephesus, meets with some people there, they say, hey, stay with us. He said, nah, I got time. I got to get on to Jerusalem. He goes all the way to Jerusalem, then he turns around and gets back to Antioch, and then after he's in Antioch, he goes back up through the cities in southern Turkey that he started with, Lystra and Derbe and those places. Nobody calls that the third missionary journey. But Paul clearly leaves Antioch and goes back up into those places where he's been, what Luke tells us, and encourages the church, keeps preaching and teaching up there. Why we don't count that, we don't know anything about it. Luke doesn't include anything about it. It's just, that's where he goes for a while.
Well, let's get it second hand right now. He's not with him.
Correct, he's hearing this later.
Yeah.
And he's not traveling with him apparently, and so he doesn't know anything for sure that's going on. But this isn't an overnight trip. This is probably months and months of Paul leaving there and getting to doing all this.
According to the little timeline I got, if he was there for a year and a half, there's roughly 6 months missing, because his third missionary journey starts around 53.
Yeah.
So there's a 6-month gap that I guess he's talking about right there.
I think that, and then he goes on up there and teaches and preaches up in Lystra and Derbe in that area.
Right.
And so you're right, this isn't just a weekend jaunt. we lose a whole bunch of Paul's life right here, and we know absolutely nothing. Luke just sort of blows it off. He leaves, goes there, shows up, does this. And then we get back to the next missionary journey, and then he totally changes the gears, and we meet this guy named Apollos. For some reason, Luke brings this guy into the story, even though Luke's not there, we don't even know who this guy is. I mean, but he suddenly shows up in the story, shows up in Ephesus, where Paul doesn't stay. This is not Paul's missionary journey to Ephesus here. He'll do that later. This is just passing through. But it talks about this Jew named Apollos who comes from Alexandria, which is a great Egyptian city, shows up in Ephesus, starts teaching. Aquila and Priscilla stay in Ephesus. When Paul leaves Ephesus, Priscilla and Aquila stay there. And Apollos shows up, and they meet him. And this, the scholars who read the book of Acts and study the book of Acts say, this is probably the weirdest half chapter in the whole book.
It's kind of like it's just thrown in there.
It is, and it doesn't have anything to do with Paul. It's just, here's this guy.
I think they're trying to make the point because they refer to him, he taught about, let me see here. He's teaching wrong.
Right.
Yes,
Priscilla and Aquila have
Yes.
to correct him.
yes.
So, I agree, it's just kind of tossed in there. It could have just been a note on the side, but it seems like the point that they're trying to make is that there were other people out doing stuff, but in this guy's case, he was a very good speaker. He was just not completely teaching properly.
And he gets taught properly.
Right.
And Aquila and Priscilla, who were there, bring him in. He's an eloquent guy. He speaks well. What do we hear about Apollos again?
When do we hear about him?
Uh-huh.
First Corinthians
Yes.
and Titus.
Yep. And what happens in 1 Corinthians?
Oh man, I don't know. There's a whole bunch of notes on it.
Here's what happened. Remember, Paul writes the church in Corinth, and he says, what's wrong with you people? There's all these divisions. You people are saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Peter, I'm of Apollos.
Oh, yeah.
And he says, did we die for you? What's going on here? So somehow, Apollos must get to Corinth, or some of the people he teaches in Ephesus get to Corinth, because he's writing to the church in Corinth, and these people are saying, we follow Apollos. So this guy's a well enough speaker, good enough speaker, influential enough guy to where people who were converted by him have become his groupies. Now Paul will later say in Corinthians, he's a fellow worker with me, he's a good guy, he doesn't criticize him. So some of the scholars suggest, well, Apollos didn't encourage this groupie kind of thing. It's just happened that way. People just decide to name him as, hey, he's the guy that taught us, so we're better than you. But he becomes pretty influential back in Corinth. He's not in Corinth here, he's in Ephesus. But he shows up, and later he'll go to Corinth. But he becomes apparently a pretty well-known guy. And maybe that's why Luke throws his name in, is to show that wherever he's at now, he's got Paul's blessing. He isn't out there causing trouble. He's now been taught the truth. He's a follower of Jesus. No matter whatever he's doing now, whatever he ends up doing, you guys need to listen to him. He's a pretty good guy.
Well, and when he mentions him in Titus, which is quite I don't know, 15 years from here, he says, do everything you can to help Zenas the lawyer and Apollos with their trip.
Yeah.
So he's
'He's
15 years later.
Paul
still,
likes him.
Yeah.
Yeah, he becomes a comrade with Paul somewhere along the way, co-teaching. So maybe this is just Luke, again, letting the church know, hey, Apollos is okay. He's a guy you need to listen to. He's somebody who's influential in the church.
We got him straightened out now.
We got him straightened out. He's been taught the truth now. Listen to this guy. But he does apparently, in church history, turns into a pretty famous fellow, pretty well-known preacher. And Luke's just sort of throwing him in here to say, hey, here's where he comes from. Here's how he gets going. Priscilla and Aquila teach him. Paul doesn't teach him. Priscilla and Aquila teach him. And so the church is growing. There's more people, as you said, more people teaching and preaching and spreading the gospel than just Paul. The church is mushrooming. It's doing well. And then that brings us to the end of the chapter. Paul doesn't abandon the Jews. Aquila and Priscilla and Apollos are still going into synagogues. He's still reasoning with the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. So I think part of Luke's comment here is the Jews are still being taught. They're still being appealed to. Paul, who's shaken his clothes off and said, "Your blood be on your head," the church isn't writing the Jews off and saying, "You guys are done." These very influential people are still going to the Jews, still preaching in the synagogues, still trying to convert the Jewish people to Jesus. And Paul just seems to, or Luke rather, just seems to say, hey, we're still working here. You Jews, we still want you. And we've still got a lot of people going to the Jews, following along behind Paul, trying to teach you people what's right. When are you ever going to listen? And that brings the end of the chapter. Paul's sort of running around. He's again sort of goofing off. I say that. He's really not, because Luke says, he's gone back through southern Turkey, going back, strengthening the churches. Luke doesn't say any more than that. That's all we know. We don't have a clue what else Paul does.
Obviously, nobody stones him or tries
Apparently
to
not.
beat him up or throw him in jail.
And again, that's the idea these people say when that proconsul gives him a pass, that's influential enough in this whole part of the empire that people don't bother Paul for a while. He gets to travel around, go places, not
Well,
get
I
out.
wonder, is he traveling alone completely?
I doubt it. Yeah, he's probably got people with him.
Even though they're not named
Correct.
people, he's got like somebody carrying his bag or
I would think so. Somebody writing for him. Some scribe. Undoubtedly, he's probably not traveling by himself. But he's still preaching the gospel. And again, he gets a time frame here where he does okay, and he's able, and I think maybe that's part of Luke's thought, is he's traveling all over the place and nobody's bothering him. He's gone back to the places where they stoned him, and nobody's bothering him.
got his posse with him.
He does.
Yeah, I think they all have like a little entourage.
I think they do, yeah. I think so.
People
Most
that
people
right
are,
thing, yeah.
they're not traveling by
Yeah.
themselves. This is not getting in a car and driving to Knoxville. This is walking through the wilds. Most people don't travel alone.
No.
You would never make it.
Especially that part of the world.
Yeah, bandits would get you.
Yeah.
And so he's probably got several people who are walking around with him, carrying his stuff, like you say, making sure he's okay, making sure he sleeps and all that kind of stuff.
Well, Jesus had an entourage.
He did. People went, he's rarely walking around by himself. There's always a group of people with him. And Paul is, again, well known enough, especially when he gets back into the Jerusalem, Antioch area, he's still got a bunch of people who know who he is. And so many of them are probably saying, we'll go with him. We'll travel with him. We'll keep you company. And so I'm sure he's not traveling alone, probably. Other questions, thoughts? Well, next week we'll start the third missionary journey. And we'll give you another map to show you where that goes. And we're just plugging along here, working our way through the
Next
book.
week is, no, never mind.
Next week we have a Wednesday.
In my mind, I'm thinking.
You thought we were the first Wednesday?
Potluck.
That'll be 2 weeks from now.
2 weeks from now.
Next week we'll do 19. 19's got a lot in it. We may or may not be able to do 19 in a night, but we'll just
We get a new Roman emperor.
we got all kinds of things happening here. He gets to Ephesus. Ephesus is a very major place where he spends many years there. So we'll just go as fast as we can and get done.
No hurry.
We're in no hurry. The aliens haven't come yet. Let's pray. God, thank you for preserving these books for us. And even as we talk about other letters and things that might have been written and who knows where they're at, I just trust you give us the things we need, and what we need to have, we do have. So thank you for that. Thank you for preserving them for us so we can know what we need to do to follow Jesus. Thank you for caring for us. Be with us as we leave this evening. We just give you all the praise and glory in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, everybody.